All right, I guess it's time to make that long-awaited Snuff video about Discworld. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me finally talking about one book again, and not one book as such, but another Discworld book. It's been a long, long time, and I have reread it like 5 or 6 times by now because, of all this stuff. I'm talking, of course, of Snuff, book 39 of the Discworld series in publication order by Sir Terry Pratchett. And yeah, we'll do the usual thing that you may remember from like all the way back in the past, where I talk about what it is and why you should read it as a quick synopsis, spoiler free, and then I'll have a bit of a drink. You go and read the damn book immediately. It's not that long. And then we talk about some details, some spoilerish details of why I think it is such a good book, and you should definitely go and read it, and what I think it does well, and in this case, one thing that it doesn't do well for whatever reasons it has come back. And I will not speculate about it this time around, maybe when we talk about Raising Steam, which will happen sometime in the future. So, with that all out of the way, let's get started and let's talk about Snuff. All right. Snuff is another Sam Vimes book. And in this case, it's very much just Sam Vimes and not so much rest of the City Watch, although they show up from time to time. And it is, of course, unfortunately, the final Sam Vimes book in that regard. So there you have that part. It focuses on Sam Vimes having to go to the countryside where, because he's the Duke of Ankh and his wife Sybil has had this family mansion before and for a long time, they have to go to a classic countryside mansion with all the stuff that comes with being like an aristocrat. And Sam Vimes encounters, well, crimes because as he so often says, like, where there's crimes, you find policemen, or the other way around. Where there's policemen, you find crimes. And stuff happens there. And it's very dark in that regard. It's very angry in a lot of ways. And it deals with topics like slavery and the like, which, if those topics bother you, then this might just be not your favorite Discworld book. I think it handles most of these topics very well, as always. There's one issue that I find somewhat troubling, and we'll talk about that near the end. It's just stuff I thought Pratchett had gone beyond, but apparently there's a bit of a flashback happening here in that regard. Beyond that, it deals with a new species that we have heard before, heard about before, but not yet encountered in any large groups, those being goblins. So that's kind of what you can expect. Sam Vimes solving crimes, fighting people, helping the poor, being really, really angry at classism, elitism, and so forth, and stuff around that kind of subject. Also, young Sam being 6 years old and being very fascinated with bodily secretions of all kinds and children's literature that kind of focuses on that. So there you have it. These are hopefully no spoilers. Now go read it. I think it's a satisfactory ending to the Sam Vimes sub-series, and yeah, I still highly recommend reading it. And now let's, have a bit of a drink and talk about why I think it is interesting to read and what I think it does, right? All right. So let's talk about something here. Let's start about the main thing here. This is, of course, very much about the divide between a countryside and the large city. It definitely focuses a lot about the differences, about stuff in the countryside being slower, sometimes more rural, well, rural, of course, but also sometimes more stuck in the past when it comes to attitudes that, say, an urban city has already, an urban center has already sort of left behind, especially when it comes to, topics like racism, topics like possibly sexism, topics like, all of these things that a more and more progressive urban center would probably have moved further along, and whereas certain countrysides are slower with that. Now, this part so far, I think, is something that we all can sort of, recognize from our own places, depending on where we live. It's just like one of those things that like large cities, large urban centers tend to be more progressive simply because they are often like a more multicultural places, more, you have more people with different aspects to being people, which makes it easier to, live your life there. It's just something that is part of that. There is, however, a second edition here, or like an additional issue, and that is, of course, this is a very British book, because depending on which country you live in, you're probably not aware of like how harsh that divide between the urban centers, those being mostly obviously London and a couple others, but especially London, how that is different from, well, landed aristocracy and the countryside, which is something that is, still sort of existing, where people own large swaths of land, possibly still with tenant farmers on it, all of that stuff, well, obviously mostly that has moved on, but like these ideas of landed aristocracy are something that have, had a much bigger impact on British society than other parts of Europe, where these things have certainly been destroyed by first like the World War One, and then even for World War Two and whatever, for example, in Germany and other parts. These issues have sort of been removed. We don't have that much anymore in that regard. Whereas in England, having an aristocracy is still like a thing. But you even have them sitting in, say, the House of Lords. So you have this more like classist element to like a country, a rural, urban divide in here that I think makes this book very specifically British, because as we all know, Terry Pratchett always has a bit of a bone to pick with the idea of an aristocracy, with the idea of people pretending to be better than other people simply because they're richer, own more land, and seem to be untouchable by law, or at least think they are untouchable by law. And in the difference to, say, like other parts of the world where these are, self-made billionaires and so forth, you have that additional element of like being, long-lived aristocratic families with, ancestors that go back way, way longer in a lot of ways. And that's something that comes through here a lot. It's something that you can see all the way back to, say, well, Guard. Certainly, very specifically, it kind of comes up again in books like Men at Arms and Feet of Clay. Obviously, also in Jingo, when these said aristocrats start building their own regiments. So it's definitely a topic that Pratchett has dealt with before, but usually in that urban context, when it's about aristocrats being, well, landlords and owning slums in which people suffer and so forth. This time around, it's about that retreat from the urban center into the countryside, possibly by people who really, really don't want to be part of that more urban elite and feel that they can still engage in a more, well entrenched classist behavior out in the countryside, because, as we already mentioned, this is something that, the countryside in this regard, the like rural areas, sort of being a couple of years behind those urban centers when it comes to, well, the acceptability of said, terrible behaviors. And I think that's a key part of why this book has, his focus on the countryside, because Ankh-Morpork as a city has moved so far into the future over the last couple of books, those, being Snuff and being Making Money and so forth. Ankh-Morpork is very much a more progressive city in these later books. So Pratchett, to deal with that ongoing topic, that, that injustice, that class injustice mostly, had to move out into the countryside, because it probably reflects some things that, well, probably really annoyed him back in the days when he wrote this book in Britain, where this is still sort of alive and well, that idea that being an aristocrat allows you behaviors in rural areas that you would probably not get away anywhere else. So while, all of Discworld is always a very British kind of thing, this one is even more so, because I feel without having that context of that British rural aristocracy, landed aristocracy, whatever you want to call it, there's a bit of context missing that may feel weird, especially when it comes to the more idiosyncratic behavior of some of these landed gentries, these landed lords, that we don't necessarily have in non-British parts of the world. Because, while we have obviously billionaires, millionaires, tech billionaires, and whatever that behave like absolute idiots, it's a different kind of being idiots. And that's something that Pratchett mentions a lot and talks about a lot in this book. So I think that's like the first important aspect here. The idea of feeling that you are different from other people, that you are better than other people, is something here. And this brings me to like a short point in this book that I really, really appreciated, that I want to mention here, and that is about the police. Now, obviously, that we all know that Sam Vimes is a policeman, he's a copper, he's a watchman, whatever you want to call him, and for someone like me, who certainly has critical views of law enforcement in a lot of ways, it's always been like an interesting aspect to see how hard Pratchett tries to make the police feel like the good guys, which kind of makes sense because from where he starts with like Watchmen in a fantasy world always being like the guys that like you as adventurers go and murder a bunch of because they're always in your way because you're probably not on the right side of the law. And that's something we come back to later on, the difference between like law and order and on the one hand and right and wrong on the other. So that's why the law and like why the Watch has always been sort of the good guys, and why this is something that is interesting to do when you also want to talk about, well, injustice in the world, which is something that definitely often comes up, and especially with a character like Sam Vimes, we see that often when he tries to, try to figure out how to make, how to create justice while also not being, a raving murderer, because there's a difference between doing things the right way and doing things the wrong way in this regard, doing things by the law. It's something that has come up in conversations about the Beast. It's certainly something that you see at the end of Night Watch when he makes very sure that Carcer gets hanged properly and not just murdered somewhere. So this is something that has come up before. But here in this book, there's a very interesting aspect where Vimes thinks of someone as civilians and then reflects on the fact that in that moment where you as a policeman, as a watchman, or at least, well, I mean, they're definitely turning more into like modern policemen compared to, or police forces compared to, say, like the old school fantasy city watch of something like guards. Um, how in that moment where you think of everyone else as civilians, you kind of become more militarized or feel more like a military and feel distant from people that are not watchmen, that are not law enforcement. And I just found this very interesting because it's certainly something that we can see in the way that a lot of law enforcement in at least large parts of the world these days acts. Obviously, we have police militarization in different countries. We have that idea that, non-police people are very much different. They don't know how hard it actually is. It it kind of talks about that idea that you feel sort of separate from other people, and feel that those, by calling them civilians, they are more naive. They don't know the truth about the world. And that's certainly something that you can also see when you talk with veterans that have actually seen a lot of violence. There's reasons why that may be the case, but it's also that aspect that it's very much a sort of like self-image kind of thing. And I just found it very interesting that Pratchett manages to kind of pull that very specific thread out and at least give it like a couple of lines of thought by Vimes trying to figure out how to deal with that dilemma of, on the one hand, having seen more violence, having seen more crime, having seen more human darkness in a lot of ways, compared to other people, and how you still try to, see yourself as part of that group and not as different, because once you have othered everyone else, that makes it so much easier to just do mindless violence to them, which, something that has definitely never happened in our world anywhere at all. So, that's something I just found interesting to point out, that this is here. The idea that you can dehumanize by dint of feeling different, which I think parallels, obviously, in a lot of ways, the way that certain landed aristocrats see both, like, peasants on their land, or like people living on their land, and of course, the main topic here, goblins, because othering is always first step towards dehumanization. Which brings us to the next part, which is, of course, the goblins and the slavery. Now, that part, I think, is done mostly well, in that it really like shows in a very, very radical way how slavery only works if you think, or like modern like chattel slavery only works if you think of your slaves as very specifically not human, possibly even not like, those animals that we have sort of like accepted as like the good guys in the animal kingdom, so to speak. which is why the word vermin comes up here a lot. And I think that's, on the one hand, very interesting. The second part I found interesting is that being treated like that also has a lot of impact on goblin society, where they start feeling that they are worthless of themselves on their own, and that has huge, terrible impact on their society, on their lives, and on their culture. And I think that's a very, very interesting aspect here, because it's certainly something that I guess we can all think of some cultures that have, through being completely, colonized, some turned into chattel slavery, some just like being pushed into the margins and further out into the margins and so forth, and abused and by their colonizers. That we can see those impacts in both directions, where like colonizers dehumanize these people, but that leads to sort of like an internalized dehumanization in a lot of ways in those cultures, whether it is native people in, well, a lot of the colonized places of this planet, like whether it's the Americas, whether it's Australia, whether it's parts of Africa. It's like, I think it's interesting to see how Pratchett manages to do that with a fantasy species without making it too specifically about one recognizable real world culture, but showing that the mechanism is the same no matter where you go with this. And I think that's one of the strengths here, that this dehumanization at that is mostly done by feeling superior from like colonizers and so forth, but also by just like sheer greed and arrogance when it comes to just like being willing to just like use these people for gain. I think works really well here in the way he does explore this specific aspect. And once again, tying this to said, well, mostly aristocrats, I think is an important aspect, because it once again shows this idea of well, elitism. Because if you're already willing to see everyone of your own, ethnicity, species, or whatever you want to use, well, in this case, species, because we're talking fantasy, but if you're already willing to see everyone else than your very specific elite class as lesser, as other, then going that next step and seeing the next species as even lesser and even more, objectify those people, I think comes very, very natural, which is something that obviously gets mentioned a bunch of times in this book when he goes back and manages, mentions that, someone who does this kind of thing to a goblin will sooner or later also do it to humans whom they feel superior to. That idea of superiority, I think, is a very important aspect that he brings back in here, and having, well, chattel slavery and having very British aristocrats being the ones profiteering from it, I think is once again very apt, because just although Britain obviously and the UK obviously abolished slavery officially fairly early on, there was still like a lot of profit happening afterwards. So yeah, I think tying it back to that was a very meaningful way. Also, obviously, the descriptions of the slavery, of the treatment of the goblins and so forth are, for Terry Pratchett, well, relatively brutal, relatively dark in a lot of ways. And I think that adds to that urgency, to that sense of urgency that I think I personally detect in most of this book. Which brings me to the next part that we need to talk about. And that's an old one that comes up again and again. I think there's something new happening here with this specific book that goes beyond the way things happened in previous books, possibly slowly shifting with Thud, where we already have the conversations about the summoning dark, which kind of shows up in this book again. And that is the conversation about legal and illegal versus right versus and wrong, and the question of justice. See, obviously that's something, as I mentioned, that Pratchett has dealt with before in all kinds of conversations. And it's something that we in our world also recognize a lot of times, where we're like, well, the laws that we as humans have created for whatever reasons don't necessarily reflect the state of the world, and certainly don't always reflect a clear morality. There are situations where, something being legal doesn't make it right, doesn't make it just. And that is certainly something that you always have to reckon with when you write crime novels, when you write, police procedurals, whatever you want to call this kind of very specific watch-related books that Terry Pratchett is writing, but it's something that we as humans also encounter in everyday politics and everyday life, where we're like, well, this feels wrong. But according to the written laws, there's very little we can do about it because, laws are usually very general. They have to be, obviously, and individual cases are obviously, well, individual, and thus don't always fit perfectly to that general law. A lot of times, the idea between right and wrong kind of falls into that. What Pratchett first shows is that there are, on the one hand, people who are aware of that difference and use it heavily to their advantage, going like, well, this may be illegal, this may be legal, but morally wrong. But because it's legal, I can get away with it. It's something that a lot of the characters that end up being the bad guys, obviously, do a lot. And I think it's interesting the way he talks about that, mostly being financiers, people that do well, sharp dealers and so forth. And I think it's interesting the way these people do that, because that's exactly how, say, financial crises start, for example. A lot of more like your corporate crimes and stuff like that work exactly in that specific way. And that's certainly, once again, something that ties back to Pratchett's general main interests about class difference in all kinds of ways, and poverty that is often the result of that kind of injustice. So on the one hand, we have people who um, do the wrong thing even just because it's legal. And then on the other hand, we have obviously questions like, what if you do the right thing even though it's illegal? And this, I think, is interesting with Snuff versus previous books, because this time around, Sam Vimes does a lot of stuff that is technically not legal, and it's very much about the question, can you still get away with it? Can you do this? And I think there's something very interesting happening here. And that interesting part, I feel, is something that a lot of writers, or not a lot of writers, but certain writers who have obviously have made the idea of right and wrong, moral right and wrong, versus the question of justice a key part of their writing forever. Also, writers that try to reflect the realities, the harshnesses of our world that is obviously not just, but oftentimes a very legalistic one, struggle with. And sometimes writers doing that need for, I guess, for their own psychological, spiritual hygiene, and just, to save their own sanity, actually let the good guys win in that very specific way. Let justice happen. It's something I think you can see, for example, with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, where a lot of times this does not happen, but there are a couple of very specific instances where there is a form of cosmic justice, a form of, well, the good guys actually get what they deserve and the bad guys actually get what they deserve, even though it's technically, not exactly legal. And Pratchett, for the last novels, has usually shied away from this. But in this book specifically, Sam Vimes and obviously his butler Willikins actually do a lot of stuff beyond that, because they decide that at some point, well, the injustices are so large that they require a changing of the law, and that requires going beyond the law and doing the right thing. And I find it interesting because it's, I feel it kind of combines with that sense of urgency that I sense in this book, particular, where it's like, well, this once I want to have the good guys actually win and the bad guys actually get what they deserve. It feels very specifically like something that Pratchett wanted to do, as a person, oftentimes maybe in a way for himself. And I find that interesting. Obviously, it can tie back to what I, as a reader, know about this being one of the final three Discworld novels. Maybe it's connected to that. Maybe it's connected to other understandings about, especially in a early 2010s world, in a post financial crisis of 2007, 2008 kind of world, in a world that had at that point gone more and more unjust in a lot of ways. That the feeling of this discontent with the injustices and that wider and growing distance between legality and, well, right and wrong, legality and morality, I guess, is what I'm saying here. That led to that urgency of going beyond, going like, well, this time around, we'll actually take the law in our own hands and put the world further. And obviously, there's always that danger, and luckily, Sam Vimes himself is a character, or the way Pratchett writes Vimes is, as a character who's constantly questioning whether that is, still sort of in the realm of the possible, in the realm of like what is maybe just maybe just permissible, because you don't want to, step too far beyond the law, because that would make you, just as bad as people abusing the law for their own way, just like, from the other side. And I think that's it's interesting how much of that discussion, of how much of that discourse, Pratchett manages to put into, once again, well, I mean, technically a comedic novel that is not that long. So I think that's just like something I found interesting with Snuff, that compared to other books this time around, a lot of times, well, you have like action scenes. You have like a very much action movie, 80s action movies kind of level of just using violence um, as a solution, by, especially in this case, Willikins, and overstepping that sort of like legal boundary that you use sort of in a society, and to keep people sort of in bounds. And I found that just very interesting compared to older books, how much Pratchett does that. And yeah, as I said, I feel a sense of urgency there, um, a sense of rage that, like, despite like years and years and years of writing about these topics, still people haven't caught on, basically. I think that frustration can sort of lead to that sort of like valve, like almost like a pressure valve, where sometimes you as a writer need to kind of overstep and go like, well, this time around, it will actually be just. And just something I found fascinating. Beyond that, there's, of course, interesting aspects in like smaller details, like the way that he deals with Fred Colon, about the idea of, well, some people have problems with adapting with, too much progress, so to speak, over time, because, well, if you're set in your ways in all kinds of ways, after a certain age, minds become less flexible, at least for a lot of us, especially if we are in fairly sort of straight circumstances, fairly safe circumstances. Then it becomes very difficult to sort of adapt to new ways. And the fact that even though you may struggle with a lot of these, more modern like changes in time, that doesn't necessarily make you a bad person as such, as long as you are still sort of trying to keep up, at least sometimes. I think Fred Cullen is a very interesting character in that regard, because the way he talks about goblins at the beginning, obviously, does not reflect how he talks about goblins at the end. And I think that's a very interesting way he deals with that. One other aspect that I think is really good, really, really important, is when we talk about the goblins in the city, and the way that they become to be accepted in society as soon as they leave their goblin ways behind, as soon as they become more like humans, more like Ankh-Morpork. And I think that's something we see in that scene, especially with Angua and Carrot. And Carrot going, it's a bit sad that people leave their traditions behind, and Angua being very much aware of the fact that, yeah, but if they would not leave their own ways behind, they would never be accepted in society. And the idea that, and this once again goes back to like the idea of like multicultural urban centers and so forth, is like, you you can be accepted in, mainstream societies as a migrant, for example, if you give up a lot of other stuff, and if you become part of that sort of global mainstream culture. And that's something that I think is interesting to be aware of. Like, if you've been to like a lot of large cities in the world, like you travel to larger cities, like, the 1 million plus kind of cities, a lot of these, at least in Western Europe, and the places I've been, like the Balkans and mostly like Europe, that after a certain point they all feel very, very similar. You have this sort of like weird mainstream sort of urban culture, and you be accepted if you leave your other stuff behind, except maybe for a few sort of things that you can market as specifically ethnic in your specific way. And the fact that yes, acceptance in mainstream society is possible, but only if you give up a lot of like what makes your culture unique. I think Pratchett being aware of that is once again one of those small bits where you can see how Discworld does reflect our own world in both the good and the bad aspects. And Pratchett sometimes dropping like one or two lines and making like a very important point that obviously a lot of people have had much larger, more complex conversations about, but like just opening these like small avenues to other thought, I think is thought is like a very, very interesting aspect of this book once again. And this, I really appreciated that aspect. So after all this praise, let's talk about the not so good bit. Because unfortunately, in a book being so aware about a lot of like, cultural differences, dehumanization, othering, and so forth, we have unnecessary racism. And it's weird. I'm talking once again about talking about in this case the local constable, and for whatever reason, Pratchett needs to make felt it necessarily to make a bunch of really stupid jokes about vaguely generically Asian sounding words in cuisine. And I don't know why. It kind of stands out in this book, I think, in a very negative way. It reminds me uncomfortably of obviously all the weird Asian racism and Orientalism that we have in interesting times. And it feels almost like a full, like, yeah, rollback to that book. And it kind of baffles me why it is there. There is one other small aspect that I guess you can technically interpret as racism, but it's a bit vaguer, which is about Constable, what's her name? Some Precious Jolson, which may be seen as a caricature of an African American, I think. But since, different cultures in Discworld are not always as clearly mapped, it's less clear there. But these are just like two or three aspects, like no moments in this book where I'm like, where's that coming from? It feels out of place in a Discworld novel, at least in a Discworld novel this far into the series. And I don't know why it is there. It annoys me. Um, because otherwise the book would feel even better. But it is there, and thus I wanted to mention it because, this is not just me praising Terry Pratchett, which I do all the time. But yeah, there are these aspects that kind of come out of nowhere and feel weird. On the other hand, we have something clever when we have, the whole idea of politics being downstream of culture, which is obviously something that the right has used before. Um, and in this case, it's done the opposite way when Lady Sybil organizes the concert by the Goblin Girl, Tears of the Mushroom. Um, and that kind of changes minds and the idea of, culture being more important in that regard in a lot of ways. I found interesting that Pratchett does actually make Discworld operate along these lines in this case. And that's once again really, really well done. So there's a lot of really good bits here, which make those two or three really bad things just like stick out even more. And I'm frankly a bit baffled because there's very few explanations I can come up with. There's one, of course, and I think we'll talk about that one in Raising Steam because it may be, I want to talk about it at the end of the series, I think. So there's that. Beyond that, it's still fun. It's got all the Discworld bits going. It further reintegrates or integrates a lot of different previous books. That's something that we've talked about before in like the recent books, like from like around book 30 on. Discworld as a whole like setting becomes more consistent in a lot of ways. So in this case, for example, when we talk about the boats on the river boats, we get a call back to the Zunes, whom you may remember if you've read Equal Rights. So we're having like another callback to one of the, well, sort of weirdly early standalone-ish books. After, meeting Escarina Smith in the previous Tiffany Aching novel, we now get the boat people once again. So that's an interesting part. Pastor Oates, whom we remember from Carpe Jugulum and the recent Unseen Academicals gets quoted again. So a lot of these bits and pieces get like further connected in different ways. Uh, which once again, I have no explanation why Pratchett, after like doing weird things for like 30 books, at some point decided that like making the whole setting more consistent, internally consistent, felt that was necessary. But it's certainly something that makes it a bit more difficult to read these later books without having read the further books. Or on the other hand, obviously rewards those of us who have read like all this stuff in publication order, and then we get all these small like hints and bits and pieces here that are, you know, callbacks to earlier stuff that we may or may not vaguely remember from way back. So, once again, it's a slightly mixed bag, or in the other way, it's a really good book with like two or three annoying bits that really, really didn't have to be in there. But beyond that, once again, I like the intensity. I like the really bubbling rage at injustice that is like very much like percolating through the entire book. I really appreciated that. And I think it's still worthwhile reading. So yeah, these are my thoughts on Snuff. If you've read the book, let me know in the comments down below what you think about it. If you haven't read the book, I don't know, tell me something else if you feel like it. I don't know. Let's have a conversation about it. If you feel like liking, subscribing, doing these other bits and pieces, I don't know, but please do so. There is a Patreon, there's a PayPal address in case you feel like actually dropping money on this. I'd obviously appreciate it, but yeah, mostly I want to talk to you, is my point. So yeah, I'll see you very soon when I talk about another book, and we'll see which one that will be. Until then, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.